So my name's Seth Bannon, and I'm going to talk today about how oftentimes doing is the best form of thinking. So when you're running any company, but especially a startup company, the unknowns greatly outweigh the knowns. For instance, when you're first getting going, you don't know if people will even want the product you're going to build. You don't know if they'll pay for it. You don't know how much they'll pay for it. You don't know how many people you need to get to pay for it to be able to raise money. There's just a million unknowns. And for this reason, sort of long strategic planning before you actually start doing things can be wasted time. And so, any sort of business plan crumbles at its first contact with reality. So if you sit down and you create a beautiful 50-page plan of how your business is going to unfold, typically as soon as you start doing something, as soon as you start launching something, the assumptions you made in your business plan turn out to be false, and your entire plan is essentially worthless. And for this reason, it makes sense to take a more iterative approach to running your company. It's better to build, it's better to test, it's better to evaluate, and then it's better to repeat that process. In this way, you sort of have an organic, fluid approach. And so I'm going to give you some examples of some companies that have taken an approach like this, and then talk about how we at my company have done this. So this is Google Glass. This is a really incredible piece of technology. It's essentially a computer on your face. It's got a really cool screen that exists in this piece of glass, almost like magic. It has voice recognition capabilities. It detects vibrations in your bones to do a better job at that. It has GPS on board. It's incredible. And Google has spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing this. I'm curious, if you were to guess how long it took them to create the first Google Glass prototype, what would you guess? 2 months. 2 months. Amazing. Anyone else? 2 years. 2 years? So I would have been on the 2-year side. So I had the opportunity to go to a hackathon in San Francisco, and on my team was a guy named Tom Chi, who was the head of user experience for Google X, which is the branch of Google responsible for the self-driving cars and Google Glass and all the other cool things they did. And he talked to me about the prototyping process for Google Glass, and the answer is 1 day. It took them 1 day to create the first prototype for Google Glass. And this was it. They took a metal coat hanger, they unraveled it, they wrapped the coat hanger around someone's neck, and then on the end of the coat hanger, they put a plastic sheet hanging in front of their face, and then they put a little projector on the person's shoulder, and they attached the projector to a laptop. And basically, they just wanted to see what would it feel like to have a screen in front of your face, projecting things. Would that just feel really terrible, and should we just abandon this idea? Or would it feel okay? And if it felt okay, maybe we should invest more resources into seeing if this is something we want to do. They put it together in a matter of hours. They said, oh yeah, you know what, this doesn't feel terrible. And then they took 2 days to build the next prototype. And then they took 2 weeks to build the next one. And now we have this beautiful piece of technology here. So Microsoft, and yes, this is not a typo, this is how they used to spell their company name. Before it was Microsoft, it was 2 guys. It was Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And they had this idea that people would pay them a lot of money if they built interpreters, specifically an interpreter for the basic programming language. But Bill Gates was a really shrewd businessman, and he didn't want to waste his time unless people were definitely going to give him a lot of money for this interpreter. And so he had this idea of to just sell it before it even existed. So he started calling up a bunch of different companies and selling them on this product that did not even exist. And he eventually got on the phone with the CEO of a company called MITS, which built the Altair, one of the earliest computers, and sold him on this basic interpreter. And the CEO said, oh, that's amazing. I want it. I'll buy it. We'll give you this amount of money for it. And then Bill Gates said, oh, great. And he hung up the phone and said, oh, shit, now we've got to build this thing. And then only after he got a commitment from someone to buy this imaginary product did he actually build it. And now Microsoft is one of the most valuable companies in the world. And so the point of those 2 stories is that even companies that are big, that you might not expect this sort of behavior from, practice this sort of behavior. So now I'm going to tell you a bit about how we do it at my company, Amicus. So Amicus is a New York City startup. We've been around for about 3.5 years. We build software that helps nonprofits raise more money and get their message out. We have gone through Y Combinator. Our work has been covered in CNN, Forbes, The Economist. We've raised about $4 million from some of the best investors in the Valley. I only say these things so you give you a reason to listen to me. And to give you one more reason, I have a bunch of these Make Mistakes t-shirts, and I'm going to be asking you questions at the end of the presentation, and if you get the answer right, I'm going to toss you a t-shirt, so pay attention. So one of the things I want to get across is that if you take this approach, you're going to have a lot of little failures, but it's actually great, and you should love these little failures because they prevent you from really big failures. And so we're going to talk about some of them here. So this is the general framework for this approach. So essentially, you frame a question. You say, like, what is my hypothesis? And so a hypothesis might be, I think if I build this social network, people will use this social network. Or I think if I build this product, people will use it or pay for it. Then you need to design an experiment to test that assumption. Then you need to figure out a prototype that you can actually build, like a real-world thing, to allow you to test it. Then you need to do the testing and the measuring. You need to evaluate the results, and then possibly you need to repeat. So I'm going to show you some examples from sales, fundraising, product development, and some even miscellaneous examples. So for sales. So when we were first getting going with Amicus, we had this idea that nonprofits would pay us a lot of money if we built them a tool that allowed their supporters to reach out to their friends and family to get those people to either donate money or to support the nonprofit. This hypothesis came from my experience in the nonprofit world, but I didn't really know if people would give us money for it. And we only had 2 developers. They were actually both students at the time, and so anything they built was going to take a long time. I didn't want to waste a ton of time building something that no one would actually pay us money for. And so, inspired by the story of Bill Gates and Paul Allen, we essentially sold our product before it existed. We had a really talented designer at the time, and he created mockups of what looked like our application, but was just basically a document, a design document. He even put it in a web browser, so it looked like something that was a screenshot. And then we went to nonprofits, and we had 3 different versions of these screenshots, and we said, hey, this is a tool that we have. Would you like to use this? Would you like to pay for this? There were actually two of the 3 people said, I don't really understand why we would need that. I don't want that. One of the 3, a lot of nonprofits said, oh yeah, like this is great. We'd love to buy this. And we said, okay, great. We'll add you to the waiting list. And of course, the waiting list was quite long because we had no product. Occasionally, some funny things happened. So there were some nonprofits that weren't necessarily sold by the screenshot, and they said, "Oh, can we see a demo account?" And our response was, "Oh, we haven't set up a demo account yet," which of course was true because there was no product. But this allowed us to test out our hypothesis that people wanted a product that we wanted to build before we actually had to build it. So now I'm going to talk about fundraising. When we first got going, we had no idea what we were doing. And no one on my team had any previous startup experience, especially fundraising experience, but we got to the point where we had a couple customers and we thought maybe people will be willing to give us money. And so we had 2 options. One, we could spend a lot of time reading up on fundraising strategies and fundraising methods and fundraising terminology, but that didn't seem very fun. Or we could just start fundraising. And so in the spirit of doing is the best form of thinking, we decided to just jump into it. And now we knew we would be sort of making asses out of ourselves because we hadn't done this before. And so what we did is we chose to start fundraising from investors that we knew we'd never want to take money from, either because we just didn't like them or because they only invested in biotechnology companies and we were a SaaS startup. And we just started pitching them. And these meetings were hilarious. They would ask us questions like, what's your MRR? Which is monthly recurring revenue. It's a term that every startup, every entrepreneur should know. And we would say, excuse me, what, an MRR? And then they would tell us, yes, monthly recurring revenue. We'd go, aha, and we'd write it down. And we had pages and pages of these things. And eventually we learned through this process of actually doing. We learned what types of questions investors like to ask. We learned which types of questions we were really bad at answering. And through that process, we felt comfortable enough to finally pitch better investors that we actually wanted money from. And when we did that, it went really, really well. So now I'm going to tell you about how to apply this strategy when it comes to product development. And I'm going to start with an example of a time we did not do this. So we had a really great idea, or an idea we thought was really great at the time, that people would love to go knock on their neighbors' doors and ask those neighbors for money or support for a nonprofit that they cared about. This is something called canvassing. And so we envisioned what this app would look like that would allow people to go and knock on their doors and see a script and record the responses. And we built this unbelievably amazing, beautiful product. We actually solved the traveling salesman problem, which is a problem where you optimize the route between houses, which is, according to some, an unsolvable problem. Like, we spent a lot of time making this a beautiful, beautiful product. And then we put it in our app. There was a little tab that said canvassing, and nobody even clicked on the tab. It turns out that people really don't want to go knock on their friends' doors and ask them for money. And it was a really expensive lesson. And so we ended up entirely scrapping that feature within about a month. If we had just put a little button in our app that said door-to-door, and if someone clicked on it, it said coming soon, then we would at least have known that people were willing to click on a thing like that and that people wanted to do that, but we didn't. And so after learning that lesson, we now take a different approach. So I'm going to give you an example of a time where we did this right. We had a different hypothesis that people would want to be able to send physical postcards to their friends with their Facebook photo on it, their signature on it, and a nonprofit's message in between, asking those friends for support. But having recently thought we had a great idea that turned out to be a terrible idea, we wanted to test this first. So the first thing we did was we put in the top bar of our app a little thing that said postcards, and someone could click on that. And if they clicked on it, it just said coming soon. And sure enough, people clicked on it. We said, okay, people are at least interested in clicking on something that says postcards. And then we said, okay, but will people really be willing to send postcards to their friends? Maybe they're just curious about what that is, but they won't actually do it. So we put a checkbox that said, you can send postcards to all of my friends. And that was it. We didn't even show them what the postcard would be. We didn't tell them which friends. We just wanted to see if people would click such a checkbox. We actually thought they wouldn't. We said, there's no way that someone would just let you send whatever to all of their friends. But sure enough, some people clicked that checkbox, right? So then we said, okay, wow, people are excited enough about sending postcards that they're willing to let us send whatever we want to some of their friends. And so then, after we had validated that hypothesis, we actually built the tool out. And it turns out that people do like it, and it went really, really well. I'm going to give you one other example. This one is applicable to a wide variety of startups. We have another idea that nonprofits might want to just sign up for this postcard tool without talking to us. So right now, our sales process is a very sort of enterprise-like sales process where you sign up for a demo, someone calls you, they give you a demo, they walk you through the product, and then you decide whether or not you want to sell. And we said, well, wouldn't it be great if nonprofits could just go onto our website, type in their credit card, and launch this tool? But of course, we didn't want to build this if nonprofits wouldn't actually do that. And so what we did is we built a landing page that makes it look like you can do this. So it literally says, get started now, takes them to a form where they can type in their credit card. And then after they type in their credit card, it just says, oh, someone will be in touch with you soon. So we sort of made it look like this process was automated, even though it wasn't. And we'll see, we don't know yet, if a lot of people type in their credit card and then are brought to the page that leads them to a manual process, then we'll actually build out the ability to do it in an automated way. So just to drive home how useful this sort of strategy is, I'm going to talk about a way we used it in a place where you wouldn't think it would necessarily be useful, which is in the design of our office. So we have an office in Soho in New York. It's a really beautiful office. We thought a lot about the design of it. We have plants. We have a 10-foot by 8-foot hammock. It's a really cool place. When we were designing our office, one of the things that we were struggling with was whether or not to paint the legs of our tables orange. or to leave them the standard metallic color. I know it's a silly thing, but our designer was getting really hung up on it. And we were going back and forth. Oh, would the orange maybe be too bright? Would it conflict with these other colors? Would the gray be very boring? It wouldn't have any character. And then our designer went so far as to sort of create a Photoshop document of what it would look like if we made all the legs orange, and it was just taking way too long. And I said, you know, guys, let's just paint one table orange and see how it looks. If it doesn't look good, we'll rebuy those legs and we'll be done. If it looks good, we'll paint the rest orange. We painted one table orange, it looked great, and then we painted the rest orange as well. It's another example of how we could have talked about that for months and never really known what the right answer was, but if we just started to do it, we could see the answer very quickly. So now comes the fun part, where you guys can win some t-shirts. So I gave you two examples at the beginning, Google Glass and Microsoft, and I told you how both of those companies implemented a lean process. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you how they executed on each one of these questions, each one of these steps. So for Google Glass, what was the question that they were trying to answer in that prototype? Beautiful, yeah. So the answer, in case you guys couldn't hear it, was Google wanted to know whether it would be cool for someone to have a screen in front of their face, and that's why they built that first prototype. Second question, what was the experiment that they designed to test that question? With a projector, yeah. Almost. So yeah, so the design for them was a metal coat hanger and a projector on the shoulder and a piece of plastic in front of them. And you answered, you should get 2 cheer shoots because you answered the second one too. And then how did they test or measure it? Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that people think about lean methodologies is that you have to have like stats, and you have to have hundreds of thousands of visitors, right? And you have to do like a machine learning analysis of the information that you're getting, but you really don't. The way Google tested it was they just put it on someone's shoulder and they were like, "Hey Joe, how does that feel?" And he was like, "Not bad." And they're like, "Okay, great. You know, that's enough for us." And so you don't have to always create a really elaborate test. Okay, same questions for Microsoft. What was the question that Gates and Paul Allen wanted to answer? Yep, beautiful. The most basic question that any startup has, will people buy this? What was their experiment? Yep. Yep, their experiment was pretty simple. We're going to call a bunch of CEOs, and we're going to ask them if they'll buy our non-existent product. What was their prototype?
There was none.
Yeah, there was none. They were great. They skipped a step entirely. And then how did they test and measure? This is an easy one. Did they? Exactly, yeah, we buy it. Yeah, it's simple. They just ask people if they'd buy. So yeah, so that in a nutshell is how you can go through that process. So in Y Combinator, which is a really great startup accelerator, they tell you that you should be doing 3 things and 3 things only. You should be building your product, you should be talking to users, and you should be exercising. And the third one is sort of a separate issue. But the first 2, they say build and talk, because you should be building and talking at the same time. You should be creating hypotheses, you should be building something to test them, and then you should be actually evaluating whether or not you got it right. So just to summarize, in the world of business, but especially in the world of startups, the unknowns greatly outweigh the knowns. So it doesn't really make sense to spend too much time on planning. It's better to build, test, evaluate, and then repeat that process. Or, to say it another way, doing is the best form of thinking. Thanks, guys.
Are there any questions?
you talked a bit about how to test your ideas with buttons on your website, etc., and measure how many people click on it. The problem is here that you first have to have audience, right? You first have to have users of your website. How do you get that?
That's a great question. So there are a number of ways that you can drive people who would be like users to one of these tests. So, for instance, one of the easiest ways of testing something is to create a fake landing page, right? So, for instance, I had a friend who was going to write a book on growth hacking. Of course, he would be good at these sorts of tricks. And he wanted to know first, before he wrote the book, if people would buy the book, right? And so what he did is he ran a simple Google AdWords campaign. He ran some small campaigns on Facebook, and he targeted the type of people that he thought would be users or readers of that book, and then brought them to a fake landing page that had, like, literally all he did was design the cover of this book, and they could click a button that said "Buy this book now," and if they clicked that, it just said, "Oh, error, 404 error, come back later." And so there are ways of sort of generating traffic that resembles the type of people that will be your users or customers. Does that make sense?
You told us that you started on New York. Why you're working in London?
Why am I not working in London?
Yes.
Well, I could go on this topic for quite some time. I think New York's an amazing city. Basically, you know, when you're building a startup, it helps to be in a startup hub. And a startup hub, you know, needs certain things that are really valuable. It needs access to capital or investors. It needs access to a network of support. So, you know, other entrepreneurs. You need access to talent. And you need access to customers. And so for us, New York had sort of the best combination of those things. There's plenty of money in New York, plenty of investors. Also, if you're based in New York, it's not that hard to raise money from Silicon Valley investors. There's a really great network of entrepreneurs in New York to support you along the way. And for us, the majority of our customers are in Washington, D.C., which is just a train ride away. And then New York is the sort of philanthropic capital of the world. And so we have a lot of customers there too.
Did you have any friction with pricing your product since it's targeted towards nonprofits?
Did we have problems?
Yeah, any friction, more like ideological, or any problems with people who would have a problem with selling commercial product to nonprofits?
So we were worried about that, but it turns out that if you're giving people a product that they think adds value, they're willing to pay for it. And we were actually really bad with pricing initially, because we would come up with a price and then, you know, no one would say no based on the price. And if no one's telling you that your thing is too expensive, then it means you're not charging enough. And so we would actually do these things where we would say, okay, you know what? This month we're gonna have a third of the people we talk to turn us down because of cost, or at least one person turn us down. And so we would say costs that we thought were outrageously high, and people were still saying yes. And so then finally, after about a week of this, we said, you know what, we're gonna just shoot for the moon. We're gonna give someone a number that they cannot say no to. And we were talking to this education nonprofit, and we quoted them $110,000 a month. And finally, they just didn't return our email, and so we knew we had sort of reached the upper bound. But you know, I think in any industry, if you're doing something that provides value, then people are willing to pay, you know, for slightly less than the value you're offering.
I mean, it wasn't necessarily my question. So I noticed that in some industries, charging startups or charging nonprofits tends to generate ideological problems with some people. So I was wondering if you guys met with some resistance, or not necessarily from your clients, but maybe from other people working with you or from your team.
So yeah, I think it used to be the case that the nonprofit world was like very hesitant toward for-profit companies, in the same way that the for-profit investor world used to be very hesitant for anything that touched the nonprofit space, right? So investors would sort of hear the words nonprofit and think, oh, there can't possibly be any profit in this. Why would we ever invest in a company that helps nonprofits? When, in fact, at least in the United States, like 1 in 8 people are employed by nonprofits. It's like $1 trillion industry. And then in the nonprofit world, there used to be a lot of hesitancy towards for-profit companies because they would say, oh, if they're doing this for-profit, then their motivations must not be pure, and maybe they're going to try and screw us later on. But I think in the last maybe 6 years, we've seen the rise of sort of social impact startups or impact companies that have a double bottom line. These are companies that both care about profits and also care about purpose, right? So they're companies that think that profit is great because you can build a better organization, but their underlying missions are doing good in the world, which is, we consider ourselves one of those companies. And since the rise of impact startups, nonprofits have been, I think, very comfortable paying for-profit companies for services. Does that answer your question?
Another question? I can see. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks.